Thank you very much. And thank you to Farokh, Kushro, Bharat, and everyone else at Khaki for having me here. It's always good to talk to you and learn about your work. And indeed, I mean, I think, this is a good moment, around the time of Indian independence to appreciate all the different heritage and history around us in Bombay. Unlike in other cities like, say, New York or Bombay, where everything is mapped and, plotted. And I know, Khaki, you're helping get to that stage, but there's still so much left in Bombay that's left kind of waiting to be explored and discovered as well. So just give me a second while I share a PowerPoint screen. So anyway, let's get into the topic of today's talk. What I'm presenting to you is research that's very much in process for me. It's, I'm not attempting to give you kind of a comprehensive look at a particular aspect of Swadeshi. That I'm sharing with you some insights of some research that I'm doing at the moment. And it began when I was talking to a professor in the National University of Singapore about maybe a year or two ago, and we both talked about doing a paper on the history of the idea of Swadeshi. Now, of course, most of us associate the idea of Swadeshi with two big things, right? Gandhi and the Swadeshi movement in Bengal in the early 20th century. But the idea of Swadeshi is much longer, right? And as I kind of began to dig into the history of Swadeshi, I mean, it's kind of like digging at the roots of a tree. You realize that those roots are much longer and more complex and go far deeper than you ever imagined. So when I talked to Farokh and Kushro about presenting on this idea, I was thinking of putting together a talk primarily on the early 20th century. But since then, the research that I had done kind of shifted the time frame much further back. So I'm today going to talk to you about stuff from about the 1840s till the very beginning of the 20th century, which is a moment where Swadeshi was happening. It wasn't always referred by that term Swadeshi, but it definitely was, in substance, Swadeshi. It's a period where most people don't know, these activities, ever took place in the first place. And oftentimes, the type of Swadeshi that's evident when you research the long history of it is very different from the type of Swadeshi you see in the 20th century, or even the type of rhetoric you see today about things like self-reliance or Atmanirbhar and such like that. After independence especially, Swadeshi ideas were translated into economic policy that was very inward-looking, kind of hostile towards exports, meant to kind of promote import substitution. And we know, of course, that didn't work very well. But in the 19th century, the idea is actually quite different. And some of the characters are also very surprising. I mean, I'm going to talk to you about British people who are talking about something like Swadeshi, in this moment, and oftentimes working with Indians. So it's kind of a head-spinning moment in terms of its ability to kind of take what we think of the idea of Swadeshi and show us that actually historically it's been very different. And I'll begin with a quote where this is a quote from the year 1906, and in the year 1906 the Swadeshi movement was in full swing. Bengal had just been partitioned in 1905, and here's someone who's kind of gently mocking Bengalis by saying that he's talking about these people, the most European of all the races to be found in India. He's not talking about Parsis, he's talking about Bengalis. And he said, even a year ago, these people didn't know what Swadesh Vastu was, right? Swadeshi items, right? And, they were doing, whatever. They were just talking. Now, who is this person? This is Lala Lajpat Rai. And he's speaking, as I mentioned, about Bengalis. Why is a Punjabi kind of, mocking Bengalis as being upstarts in the idea of Swadeshi? And it's quotes like this that, again, gives us a clue into how Swadeshi did not just begin with the Swadeshi movement in 1905. So again, if we plot Swadeshi on a timeline, we know a lot about what Swadeshi activity was like once Gandhi came to the scene. There were two big bursts of activism where Swadeshi became quite important. One, of course, was the non-cooperation movement 100 years ago, and the other was civil disobedience, which started in 1930. And in those moments, of course, the charka and khadi become really important symbols, right, in the Indian nationalist movement. And Gandhi made Swadeshi not just an economic concept, but a moral concept as well, in the sense that Swadeshi was meant to kind of symbolize, specifically khadi was meant to symbolize the poverty of India, and by making khadi, even the poorest of the poor could, take part in this process of self-help and regeneration of the Indian nation. And consequently, Gandhi's idea of Swadeshi clashed oftentimes with a lot of merchants and industrialists who had their own vision of Swadeshi. I mean, so if we look in the 1920s and 1930s in newspapers like the Bombay Chronicle, you'll see lots of products being made by factories in Bombay which are being labeled as Swadeshi goods. And there's a huge debate about, what is really Swadeshi? Is it Khaki or is it something that could be made in a factory? But that's perhaps for a different topic on a different day. So Gandhi and Swadeshi is one thing we all are pretty familiar about. And the other thing, of course, that we're familiar about is the Swadeshi movement in Bengal. And as I'm sure most of you know, if not all of you know, the roots of the Swadeshi movement, at least the popular phase of the Swadeshi movement, came with the partition of Bengal in 1905, which was discussed for a few years beforehand by Lord Curzon and went into effect in 1905, and really kind of galvanized nationalist politics. For the first time, you have really mass-based politics, and you have ordinary people engaging in nationalist activity and specifically Swadeshi activity as well. Now, this has been pretty well documented. If you want to read a very good book on Swadeshi in Bengal, no better book is available for you than this by Sumant Sarkar, the kind of doyen of Indian social history. It's a really detailed look, not just at the economic ideas, but the political and revolutionary ideas in Swadeshi as well. But we need to remember also that Swadeshi was not just about Bengal. There was Swadeshi activity during the Swadeshi movement well beyond Bengal as well. So, I mean, look at this ad, for example. I mean, this is from Lahore, right? And as you research Swadeshi, you realize that some rather unexpected places like Lahore were actually fulcrums of many aspects of the Swadeshi movement. So this talk will concern three different moments, rather contiguous moments, looking at Bombay and Western India at large, and understanding how Swadeshi activity kind of developed. And like I said, I'm going to go back all the way to the 1840s and 1850s, when there was discussion on a very large scale about things like the drain of wealth and the need to promote manufacturers in India. We'll move on to the 1870s and 1880s, where you have something called kind of the proto-Swadeshi movement. That was not the term they used, but it's the term retrospectively that some historians have adopted to describe this movement. It was, Swadeshi again in all but name. And by the 1890s, you start to see terms like Swadeshi and Swadesh come up quite commonly in the press. Specifically, things like Swadesh Vastu. In the press in places like Lahore and Calcutta and Bombay to a certain degree, there was talk of a Swadesh Vastu movement by the very early years of the 20th century. So again, this talk kind of pushes the timeline back to look at relatively unexplored roots and how they shaped later ideas of Swadeshi. So I'll begin in the 1840s and 1850s. And, this is very far back in time, obviously, right? I mean, this is a moment when Bombay is an overgrown town, basically, right? I mean, it's nowhere near the urbs prima and Indus. It becomes later. It's a rather rough and tumble place, but with a growing economy and a growing population. And it was again one of the most prosperous parts of India. Yet one thing that's quite remarkable is that at this moment in Bombay and in many other places throughout India, as well as in places in Great Britain, you see a strong upsurge of conversation in things like the drain of wealth. The idea that India was growing more and more poor as time went along, and the British colonialism was responsible for destroying India's industries and India's wealth. Now, the drain of wealth is, of course, often associated with people like Dadabhai Naoroji or Ranade or Dutt. But the idea of the drain of wealth is actually much older than that. I mean, there were British officials in the late 18th century, right around the time Bengal becomes, an official part of, the East India Company's territory, who are talking about stuff like a drain of wealth. And I'm sure it must have been talked about by Indians as well. We just don't have the sources, or at least, the sources haven't been documented. So what we do know is that by the 1840s, there's a lot of media, i.e. newspaper in this era, discussion about poverty, the drain, how India's manufacturing industries were being destroyed. And remember, again, this is a moment where, India goes from being a textile world superpower, a producer of a good chunk of the world's textile goods to having its textile industry largely decimated, not completely. Scholarship of people like Tirthankar Roy have pointed out that that's not the case. I mean, India still had a relatively robust textile manufacturing economy, throughout the length and breadth of the country, but nevertheless, it was not as big as it once was, and lots of people were out of work. The discussion at this time is being propounded by both Indians and Britons. Here you have on the screen, and I apologize, a lot of the images in my presentation today are not terribly attractive because, all I can really give you are scans of newspaper articles, which don't make for terribly interesting graphics. But here is a newspaper from London called the Colonial Gazette, which was quite critical of British colonial policy, which is talking about how India had been impoverished by Britain's commercial policies. That Britain had basically destroyed India's commercial foundations through its textile manufacturing economy, and their language could be quite sharp. So here's again the Colonial Gazette describing the British Parliament. A quote, I'm going to begin the quote over here. "The British Parliament possesses a terrible strength. An act of Parliament can kill or cure the myriad natives of India. What a pity that this powerful engine should be in the hands of presumptuous blockheads who whirl it about blindly, doing mischief 10 times for once that they do good," end quote. So here you have a British publication from the 1840s referring to the British Parliament as blockheads, which, as I've discovered from a bit of research, was actually a pretty common term used for parliamentarians in this era, specifically for the policy that they're inflicting on India, which again was that policy of general impoverishment by stymieing the manufacturing economy and draining away the wealth of the country and making the millions of people who lived in India quite poor. You do have British people talking about poverty in India, both in India and Great Britain. British people, obviously living here, and those who are still in, the islands. And increasingly, you start to have documentation of a lot of Indian, complaints about British policy in India in an economic nature. For some of you who might know of the scholar J.V. Nayak, who passed away a few years ago, he had written a pretty well-known paper where he talked about kind of the early examples of the drain theory before someone like Dadabhai Naoroji. And one person he talks about was a man called Bhaskar Pandurang Tarkadkar, who wrote a series of letters in 1841 to the Bombay Gazette, which was a major newspaper at this time. And the Bombay Gazette, during this moment, had a relatively pro-Indian editor who was willing to publish relatively incendiary stuff. And Bhaskar provided that incendiary material. He wrote a series of 8 letters, which were, quite, revolutionary and quite bold and brave in tone. He criticized everything from, the lack of political rights in India to the drain of wealth, the treatment of princely states, the opium war that was going on in China at the time. I mean, he criticized British people as being, terribly greedy people who were forcing drugs upon an innocent people. He criticized wars going on in Afghanistan. It's pretty gripping stuff. But one of the things that he focused on was, again, this drain of wealth and the destruction of Indian industries. So here's a quote from one of the articles that he wrote in 1841. "Oh, unhappy fate, India has been got hold of by a race of demons who would never be satisfied until they have despoiled her of all her precious things and reduced her sons and daughters to total beggary," end quote. So again, pretty emotional stuff, right? I mean, so we can tell, if one person was being so vocal in his views about, British policy, economic policy, chances are he's reflecting much wider views about, popular views about, what people were thinking of British policy. And particularly people like Bhaskar singled out British tariff policies for, being the engine of the drain of wealth. So, this was an era when Britain liked to talk about itself as being a free trading nation. And as many critics pointed out, what that meant essentially was that Britain had free trade for itself, but it foisted very unfree trade upon everyone else through tariffs. So, if Britain wanted to export textile goods from Manchester to India, they were exported into India at a very nominal tariff. But if India wanted to export its goods to Great Britain, they were charged a really high duty. that made it completely uncompetitive. And so this was something which people like Bhaskar focused on. And he said, again here, quote, were cotton cloth manufactured here, how much cheaper we could get it than we do now, and how much India would be relieved from its present reduced state, end quote, meaning its dependence on British-made textile manufacturers. So, people like Bhaskar were actually quite influential on a later generation of Indian nationalists. Dadabhai Naoroji, for example, didn't mention him by name, but mentioned his group of fellow Maharashtrian thinkers quite often later on in his life when he talked about the drain theory. So, when Naoroji made his first enunciation of the drain theory in 1867 in printed form, he talks about people like Bhaskar and how they talked about increased poverty in India. And in I think the year 1901, when he's talking to Lord George Hamilton, who was the Secretary of State for India and a very conservative kind of not very friendly person towards ordinary Indians, he again mentions people like Bhaskar as being very early pioneers in kind of this discourse of how British policy had really starved India of a lot of its wealth. So here you have British people in Britain, Indians in India, but there was another element who played a role in this discussion, and these were Anglo-Indians. Or I'm not talking about Anglo-Indians. I'm not talking about Anglo-Indians who have part Indian and British heritage, but the term Anglo-Indian was used to refer to Britons or Europeans who were living in India. And one of the most prominent people in this discussion was a name who you might recognize, a person called George Boyce. Boyce was a Scotsman, and Bombay played host to a number of quite remarkable, progressive, free-thinking Scotsmen who came, and worked in the newspapers like the Bombay Times, or worked in places like Elphinstone College. And Boyce came to Bombay in 1840 to take over the Bombay Times. And he became very quickly kind of a pillar of the intellectual life of the city. He, became friends with people like Baudaji Lad, Jamshedji Jijiboy, Kawasi Jahangir Reddy Money, others as well. And he made the Bombay Times into quite a paper which would oftentimes express quite brave and commentary that would push the line against accepted, forms of free speech. And one of the things he was very interested in, and this is something that was tipped on to me by Murli Ranganathan, who I'm sure many of you know, who has read more of the Bombay Times than I have. One of the things he was very interested in was the promotion of Indian manufacturers. He was very excited about advertising whenever Indians or Britons along with Indians would set up factories or set up manufacturing units in different parts of India. So the Bombay Times would, whenever something was established in India, they would carry, an article. So, for example, in 1840, they carried an article about how a Briton and an Indian had got together to start an indigo processing facility in Khandesh. Or, the same year he talked about advances in the manufacturing of sugar in Madras, made by a resident of Pondicherry, and how this would help, indigenous people in Madras, Tamils or people specifically who lived in sugar-producing regions like Ganjam, to manufacture sugar and make India not just an exporter of raw goods, but an exporter of finished products as well. So he was really into promoting different methods of Indians' ability to produce, finished goods. And he played a small role in helping Baudaji Lad start a paper manufactory in Bombay as well. But one of the things he was associated with, which, is particularly interesting for a story, was an industrial school in Sivri, so not too far away from where I am. So in the 1840s, Boyce built his house in Sivri. And Sivri, of course, back then was basically jungle, right? It was 10 miles away from Bombay. I'm not sure precisely how he commuted every day to work. I mean, I guess he galloped with a pretty fast horse to get into town. His bungalow might or might not still survive. This might be something interesting for those of you in Khaki to investigate. But there is a large bungalow next to Sivri Fort, which Arun Tekekar claims might have been Boyce's actual bungalow. If it is, that's incredible, but we don't know for sure whether or not it is his or not. But in 1849, next to his house and next to the water, he established an industrial school for people in Bombay. Now, the industrial school was, it had a rather unique mission that, might strike us as being a little different from what we imagine an industrial school to be. And industrial schools had something to do actually with this problem of thuggy, which was quite prevalent in central India in the early 1800s, or at least British people thought that it was quite prevalent. You had groups of people who supposedly were professional criminals, and starting with a man called Sleeman, there was an attempt to reform these individuals and turn them into productive members of the Indian economy. And in Jabalpur in the 1840s, there was an industrial school that was set up specifically to take these so-called thugs and reform them and make them into blacksmiths or carpenters or people who worked with pottery. And this was modeled on a British institution called the Ragged School, which was an institution that was set up by a woman called Mary Carpenter, who also had connections to India. She was also interested in Indian social reform. But she noticed that in Great Britain, there was a huge problem of street urchins, street children. So she set up things called ragged schools, which were meant to take children off the streets, off the sidewalks, and train them, give them vocational education. And that model was copied in India. And became, the prototypes of what would eventually become industrial schools. So Boyce establishes an industrial school in 1849. And, again, the objective of these industrial schools is to train juvenile delinquents. So he said specifically, every year, the police force in Bombay will arrest 200 children who were caught in, petty crimes. And before they became hardened criminals, the idea was to take these children and teach them how to become blacksmiths or carpenters or engineers in order that they avoid a life in crime. But importantly, the goals of these schools also had a much wider ambit. So here is Boyce talking about what the goal of schools were at this moment, the late 1840s, early 1850s. He says, quote, "Our ulterior object is by these means to spread the improvement amongst the arts and manufactures of India, to bring into existence a community of missionary artisans who may diffuse over the land the handicrafts of Europe," end quote. So these schools were not just open to criminals or thugs or what have you. They were open to the general public as well. So if you went to one of these schools, you might see a child who had been picked off the street by the Bombay police, or you might see, a member of Bombay society who just wanted to learn how to become a blacksmith. And you notice over here that Boyce is also saying, he wants to see the diffusion of the handicrafts of Europe across India. So he's thinking, about training Indians in European science and technology. What did he do? I mean, we know that, when he established the school by the early 1850s, he brought in native Indian looms and also European, British-style cotton fly shuttles. So he's kind of mixing and matching indigenous technology with with British technology as well. He brought in pottery technology. He according to Arun Tikekar, he might have introduced the technology of glazing, tile glazing or pottery glazing to Bombay. And the people who were trained in the school turned out all sorts of interesting things. They turned out some engineering goods, blacksmith goods, metal work. Supposedly a group of German professors came through Bombay and employed the students of these schools to actually cast pottery, models of the heads of quote unquote representatives of the leading races of Bombay, i.e. like the model of a head of a Maharashtrian, the model of a head of a Hindu, Gujarati, the model of a head of a Muslim, Bora, the model of a head of a Parsi. And that was another industrial item that was produced at these things. This industrial school was again set up by people like Boyce, but in cooperation with Indians. So Bahudaji Lad served as a doctor at the school. Jamshidji Jiji Boy served as a financial contributor. So did Ready Money, as well as Manguldas Nathubai, who's a prominent Gujarati merchant. And the school was eventually taken over by David Sassoon. It might still survive today. there is a Sassoon school in Matunga West, not far from where I'm, talking from today, which I believe is the descendant of this institution. But in an era before Bombay had, say, technical institutions like VJTI or a university to speak of, things like this industrial school, these were places where Indians were able to train in manufacturing and industrial arts and sciences. So an unusual place for the beginning of Swadeshi activity. And indeed, throughout much of the 19th century, some unusual places would serve as kind of the place where a lot of early Swadeshi activity would take place. I mean, another place which would become quite important were actually jails, believe it or not, because the British government would have something called jail industries in its various jails. They'd get jail inmates to weave material or construct things or make pottery, and papers like Native Opinion, which were run by Mandlik, the Maharashtrian social reformer and the Maharashtrian Sanskrit scholar and kind of early nationalist activists, actually saw these as important places for Indians to acquire industrial skill. So again, very different from what we would imagine the birthplaces of Swadeshi to be. And the unusual roots of Swadeshi, that's a theme which continues as we kind of move along, in terms of time period, because in 1851 something happened in London, which gave another big boost and inspiration to how Swadeshi activity would take place in India. And this activity was the Great Exhibition of 1851. This was when Queen Victoria and Prince Albert sponsored this large exhibition of industrial and manufactured and art goods to take place in Hyde Park in London. The Crystal Palace was established, was built for this purpose, and later on the Crystal Palace was, of course, moved to South London. But this was the world's first big, industrial and manufacturing exhibition, and it was a hit, right? I mean, this was the inspiration for what later became World's Fairs. And at this great exhibition, not only were the manufactured goods of Europe on display, but so were the goods of India as well. So Bombay supplied, representative manufactured goods. So did places like Agra or Calcutta or Lahore or what have you. And people like George Boyce actually encouraged wealthy Indians to go to the Great Exhibition, to travel to London in 1851, to be inspired by what they saw and hopefully come back to India and maybe take the ideas and the types of technologies they saw and try to copy those technologies and spurt manufacturing industry in India in consequence. So that began a moment when exhibitions were copied throughout India. So after this great exhibition took place in London in 1851, you start to see exhibitions taking place in India. Originally, these were organized by British people. So, for example, in 1853, the Madras government organizes an exhibition. In Bharuch, another one was done by British civil servants in 1869. And there were later ones done in Lucknow and Lahore in the 1860s. But starting in 1856, at least 1856, some Indians start to organize these exhibitions themselves. So Salar Jung, the famous Diwan of the Nizam of Hyderabad, a man who was well exposed to currents of thought coming from Europe, organized an exhibition in Hyderabad to display manufactured and industrial goods that ordinary Hyderabadis would produce. So you start to see Indians emulating again this model of exhibitions to kind of promote knowledge and ideas of the importance of manufactured and industrial goods. So keep this model in mind as we move ahead to the next moment of my talk, which is the 1870s and 1880s. This is after the mutiny. This is a moment, the 1860s seem to be relatively, non-happening in terms of a lot of Swadeshi activity for understandable reasons. But by the 1870s, you start to see again, a lot of discussion which we can identify as being Swadeshi in name, in all but name rather, and what I refer to and many other scholars refer to as being proto-Swadeshi. And again, you see discussion about deindustrialization in India. The idea that British policy was destroying the manufacturing and industrial potential, excuse me, of India. This was linked again to debate about tariff policy. So you remember when we talked about earlier on a lot of Indian misgivings, people like Bhaskar Pandurang talked about how tariff policies were destroying a lot of Indian industry. Well, the 1870s is a moment where tariff policy is changing, both in Great Britain and in India. And these waves of kind of proto-Swadeshi activity, not surprisingly, take place around the time that tariff policy is being debated, which could, either make or break industry in India, especially as, cotton mills started to come up in Bombay from the 1850s and 1860s onward. This is also a moment where, those exhibitions that I talked about just in the previous slide really start to flourish in India. You start to see lots of exhibitions and exhibitions organized by Indians as well. And you begin by the 1870s to see something new. Swadeshi associations, which were designed to promote the manufacture and the consumption of Swadeshi goods. Now, again, oftentimes they are not using the term Swadeshi, but they'll use another term like indigenous goods or native manufacturers or what have you. But again, it's Swadeshi in all but name. So again, when we talk about deindustrialization and the rhetoric that Indians adopted, to kind of complain about British policy, perhaps nothing, is more striking than the essay of someone who didn't have anything to do with Bombay, someone who visited Bombay nevertheless, but a man who came from a very different region, Bengal, a man called Bholanath Chandra. Some of you may have heard of this individual. Bholanath Chandra was an entrepreneur from Bengal, a failed entrepreneur. So he understood how difficult it was to kind of set up a business or an industry in India. He traveled extensively throughout North India as well as in Bombay. But starting in 1871, he writes a series of very, very long and kind of rambling and very verbose articles. They're not very fun to read. Called, A Voice for the Commerce and Manufactures of India. In spite of being kind of a pain to read, they contain some really interesting ideas, and again, quite pioneering ideas about, precisely, how, many Indians thought, industry was being destroyed by British policy. So here's Chandra in one of his more, concise and precise moments, talking about, British rule in India. So he says, British rule has, quote, culminated in the ruin of our national industry and homemade manufactures. No untruth is more strenuously sought to be impressed upon our minds than that we form an agricultural nation. Such a misrepresentation is impeached and scouted by all history. From time immemorial, India has never been a consumer of foreign goods and manufactures. She is the cradle of all the principal arts which minister to the well-being of mankind. The rest of her world is a pupil in them. It is she who manufactured for other nations, while none manufactured for her. So here is Chandra saying in 1875 that we were the original manufacturers, India. All other countries copied from us. We were the original kind of industrial superpower. And look at us now. We've been reduced to this humiliating position of being an agricultural nation. Now, Chandra did not always have his facts correct. Okay, so I mean, when he says India was the original manufacturing nation, that's an exaggeration. Chandra was a little bit of a chauvinist. He completely discounts the idea that there were manufacturers in places like China or other parts of the world as well, and India, of course, was not the sole manufacturer. But he hits upon an idea that is carried out throughout many other Indian thinkers at this time, which was India at one point in time was a manufacturing superpower. It manufactured to the rest of the world. It was an exporting power. Okay, and that part is important. It produced goods for export. And look at us now, we have become an importing nation. So that dynamic between import and export becomes a very important part of the conversation about Swadeshi. And people like Chandra wanted India to become an exporting nation again. Now, Chandra's work was picked up by people in Bombay. And some people in Bombay were a little critical. I mean, many people in Bombay thought that Bengalis just were talking a lot and not actually doing stuff. And this is precisely what Native Opinion said about Chandra's articles. I mean, criticized him a little bit and said, look, we just need to actually set up factories, and we have the capital, we have people who would serve as labor. Let's stop talking about it and writing long 80-page dissertations as Chandra had done about the need to do so. But I mean, there was a general tone of indignation in the European press, in the Indian press in Bombay, again about how India had been reduced to kind of this nation of importers. So here is the Native Opinion chiming in 1873. Quote, "It will be observed that a few spinning and weaving factories excepted, so those few cotton manufactories that have been set up in Bombay, no new branch of industry has been introduced in this presidency in Bombay in 1873, and that in this respect, our long contact with the greatest manufacturing nation of Europe, i.e. the English, who have become our teachers in many things, has produced scarcely any result at all, and that all our articles are at the same time as they have been for the past 1,000 years. So here's criticism saying, the British, they're now the world's biggest manufacturing power, and yet that has count for nothing for we as Indians, because they haven't done a damn thing to help support and set up industry in India. So people in Western India started at this moment to say, look, let's actually do something. Okay, so cotton mills had been set up. Let's go a step further and start to stimulate industry in different ways. And in the year 1875, someone who went by the acronym MGR published a letter in the Times of India talking about what had been happening in Pune. And what this man, MGR, said, not to confuse him with the man involved in spices, was that a series of quite remarkable developments had taken place in Poona. This man said that around the year 1872-73, a Maharashtrian had delivered a number of lectures in Marathi talking about the drain of wealth and talking about the need to stimulate industry in India and promote Swadeshi goods. I mean, he didn't use the term Swadeshi, but that was the idea that he was conveying. He conveyed this idea of the need for some modicum of self-sufficiency. And this is what this Maharashtrian said. He said, quote, "The imbecility which has come upon a nation by which it allows itself to depend on the smallest article of convenience or luxury upon the foreign manufacturer, although the raw materials lie at our doors in tempting profusion, this imbecility is at the root of all the present evil." And he goes on to say that, the example of the Americans were pointed out to show that with a little small sacrifice, what might be achieved by a country which was so highly favored by nature as India to become self-dependent in these matters. So this Maharashtrian is essentially saying, look around us. India has all these abundant natural resources, agricultural, mineral, you name it. We are a country like America, which also has all this abundant natural resources. Let's do something with that. And so this Maharashtrian started this moment where people in Pune started to do stuff like wear Swadeshi clothing, wear Khaki clothing, set up Swadeshi stores, set up Swadeshi associations. Now, by the letters MGR, that gives away a hint that maybe the author of this article was actually Mahadev Govind Ranade. And indeed, the person who gave those 3 lectures in Marathi might have been Ranade himself as well. So Ranade himself was probably a stimulus to this movement. It was around 1870, he moved to Pune to become a judge over there. Ranade took part in the intellectual life of Pune. He helped with the Poona Sarvajanik Sabha. And here he came into contact with people like G.V. Joshi, who was known as Sarvajanik Kaka, kind of the main mover of the Poona Sarvajanik Sabha in the 1870s and 1880s. And Joshi was known again for going around in Swadeshi goods. He only wore Swadeshi clothing. And Ranade might have been one of those people who inspired him to do so through those particular lectures. Now, again, why is this happening in the 1870s specifically? Well, again, it's timed with those debates about tariff policies, but it was also timed with a committee that took place in London called the Fawcett Committee. And the Fawcett Committee was a parliamentary investigation into why India was so poor. It was, put together by a man called Professor Fawcett, who was a very sympathetic voice towards India in the British Parliament, and a friend of people like Dadabhai Naoroji and W.C. Banerjee. And the Fawcett Committee was actually shut down by the conservative British government once they came to power, because it had started to really kind of, say a lot of uncomfortable stuff about what British policy had been doing in India. So Dadabhai Naoroji was one of the people who gave evidence to the Fawcett Committee, and his evidence to the committee was considered so firebrand that it wasn't published. It became the nucleus of some lectures that Naoroji gave later, that kind of laid out the drain of wealth. Swadeshi activity is taking place in the 1870s due to events that are taking place not just across India in terms of imperial policy, but also that are taking place in places like London. Through what, Ranade is saying, these early Swadeshi activists are consciously looking abroad when they think about Swadeshi. They're thinking about countries like America. Increasingly, they will think about countries like Japan once the Meiji Revolution has taken place over there as well. So this is not a very inward-looking movement where people are just saying everything foreign is bad, we need to just create our own stuff. This is a movement which is really trying to look at the rest of the world to get ideas about how India can become, a country that's self-sufficient, but also a country that can export a lot of goods. So not something that's cut off from the rest of the world. And again, the medium through which a lot of Swadeshi activity was funneled was through, again, these exhibitions. So starting in probably 1875, Ranade and a group of other Maharashtrian intellectuals like K.T. Telang set up something called the Native Arts and Industrial Exhibition in Pune. And this exhibition kept on going until at least 1888, perhaps with some gaps in between. But it was a pretty remarkable thing in the sense that a group of, Indians, mostly Maharashtrians, but also some Parsis and some Gujaratis as well, got together, pooled a bunch of funds in order to get indigenous manufacturers to exhibit their wares. And the stuff that were exhibited in these exhibitions were pretty remarkable. So there was a guy called Madhavrao Kelkar, for example, who was manufacturing printing ink that was so good that it was being used by the government of India. And it was being used by newspaper presses in Bombay. Another guy called Palwalkar was manufacturing candles. And these candles caught the attention of Dinsha Manakji Petit, the famous Parsi industrialist, who sponsored his further research in candle making. There was a man from Sholapur who exhibited firecrackers, which Ranade said would be popular at the time of Diwali. So then, back, as in now, your ears would be blown out with firecrackers, and that would be the work of indigenous Swadeshi manufacturing as well. And a whole bunch of other things were made by these ordinary people living in parts of what are today Maharashtra or in the city of Bombay or Pune. Improved native cloth looms for manufacturing cotton. And goods were exhibited from as far away as Agra, Calcutta, Jabalpur. And these exhibitions became so popular that even the governor of Bombay, Philip Woodhouse, came and visited Poona at this time to see what was going on. So this served as a really important stimulus for getting people to know what Indians were doing to invent new goods, and also trying to get wealthy Indians to financially support these endeavors. So Ranade specifically said, you wealthy manufacturers in Bombay, especially you Parsis, give your money to these people working in places like Sholapur or Pune or whatever, in order to support indigenous manufacturing. And to a certain extent, this happened. Now, the other really big innovation of this period is you start to see Swadeshi associations. So in that original article that I showed from 1875, when MGR is writing, he says that Swadeshi associations were being set up in places like Bombay, Poona, Satara, Nagpur, Solapur, and many other cities throughout not just Maharashtra, but also Gujarat. And newspaper records from the 1870s largely confirm what Ranade was saying. We do know that activity was taking place in the Bombay presidency, as well as in places like the central provinces. So, for example, in 1873, a Swadeshi store was opened in Nagpur. And, the type of Swadeshi patriotism that was being shown by people who were setting up these stores is recognizable in terms of what would later come with, say, the Swadeshi movement. So a Marathi language paper had, talked about the opening of the Swadeshi store in Nagpur as such, quote, "The sons of India, who were but recently dealing with words only, are taking a practical turn in the cause of their country, and the European manufacturers of cloth will now have to die of starvation!" Exclamation point. "Beware, O ye Englishmen, of native patriotism!" Two exclamation points. So, here is the type of kind of, very strong kind of, anti-British manufacturing or anti-British patriotism that would be the hallmark of the Swadeshi movement in the 1900s being exhibited in Maharashtra in the early 1870s. But importantly, this was not the only type of Swadeshi patriotism that's being bandied about. Again, people like Ranade were perfectly comfortable working with British administrators and British capitalists. They essentially wanted all the expertise that was possible to be utilized by Indians. So it wasn't, narrowly defined in this sense at all. So, a little later on, the pioneer of Allahabad records that a Swadeshi association had been set up in places in Gujarat like Surat, Ahmedabad, Bharuch, Rajkot, and they give us details of what exactly had taken place in Surat. So apparently in Surat, a Muslim merchant, a man by the name of Nawab Mir Sayyid Alam Khan, had organized a meeting where 1,500 Surtis had got together, including representatives of all the big mercantile families from different communities, and they pledged to only wear Swadeshi goods. I mean, they didn't use the term Swadeshi itself, but they also set up a joint stock company to set up a store that would sell Swadeshi goods. So in this era, Swadeshi was for patriotism, but it was also for profits. It was a way for Indians to make money. Many other joint stock companies were set up to both manufacture and sell Swadeshi goods. And we know that it started to be quite popular because a little later in the 1880s, the Jame Jamshid, the Parsi Gujarati paper, talked about how Maharashtrians were adopting native cloth, indigenous Indian cloth, rather than Europeans, and they urged people in Bombay to follow the same. But again, they weren't urging exclusively Indian nationalism that was anti-British. The Jame actually encouraged the governor of Bombay, Richard Temple, to hold an exhibition of indigenous goods, only indigenous goods, that would highlight the manufacturing potentials of Indians. So here again, Indians are borrowing the language of what was being practiced around the world, these exhibitions or even joint stock companies, but we're using them in order to kind of create indigenous industry. Not all British people were supportive of these attempts. So the Times of India, which by the 1870s had become rather haughty British anti kind of looking down upon a lot of Indians. They kind of dismissed these Swadeshi associations as being Luddite, i.e., kind of out of sync with the times. They said, look, the reason why the stuff is happening is the reason why Indians are getting so concerned about reviving their indigenous manufacturers is because they just hadn't adopted modern technology, and it was a sign of the times that modern technology from Europe would displace Indians, and they better well just get used to that fact. But not every British person adopted these views. Many other British people were quite supportive of these Swadeshi activities as well. So what you have by the 1880s is a moment where activity is Swadeshi in all but name, to where it becomes actually associated with the term Swadeshi. Now, I don't know when the term Swadeshi in its current context is first used. Finding it would be like searching for a needle in a haystack, because you'd have to look at it, vernacular papers in Gujarati and Bengali and Marathi and what have you, and we just don't have the bandwidth to do that. But we know through certain signposts that the term Swadeshi, in terms of how we currently understand it, had come into popular use by years like 1886, because as many of you know, in the year 1886, Jamshedji Tata sets up or at least renames a mill in Kurla the Swadeshi Mills, and it's important that this mill specifically is called Swadeshi because the Swadeshi mill was designed for producing export quality goods. So here Swadeshi is not being used to kind of provide import substitution type of industry, khadi cloth for Indians, but rather goods that would be manufactured and actually exported to places like Japan or China. And again, in 1889, another mill called the Swadeshi Mills was set up in Nagpur. And once more was designed with patriotic motives, but also to participate in an export-oriented economy. So we've come to the final moment, the 1890s. And this is a moment where now the terms Swadeshi and Swadesh Vastu is starting to appear, at least in English language periodicals, relatively frequently. You start to see references to things like Swadesh Vastu or Swadeshi, but again, the places where it's appearing might surprise us. In 1895, a Swadeshi store was opened in Lahore. So going back to, we began with Lala Lajpat Rai. Lahore is surprisingly one of the real hotbeds of Swadeshi activity in the 1890s. Organizations like the Punjab National Bank are set up out of this Swadeshi activity. And that Swadeshi spirit is being contested by various Lahoris. When Lala Harkishan Lal sets up the Punjab National Bank in 1894, he says he's doing so as a Swadeshi activist, but there are Swadeshi activists in Lahore who are saying also, no, this is not the right idea of Swadeshi. Your idea of Swadeshi is profit-oriented. Our idea of Swadeshi is associated with, kind of patriotism and, doing stuff for the good of the motherland and kind of boycotting British goods. So in this era, Swadeshi was still a very, contested idea. You could be a profit-seeking industrialist who was Swadeshi and one who was kind of, talking about self-sacrifice and khadi cloth. And both of you had an equal, kind of claim to being a Swadeshi activist. There are other organs that are being set up with names like Swadesh Vastu Pracharak or Swadesh Pracharini Sabha. And these organizations are, being endowed with certain missions, so here's the mission statement for a magazine called the Swadesh Vastu Pracharak, which was set up in Lahore in 1895. It behooves every well-wisher of his country to make up his mind to use as far as possible the articles of Indian manufacture and to induce his friends to do the same. So again, here's that idea of Swadeshi being kind of, intrinsically patriotic and kind of anti-British goods. Around the same time, we do also see ideas of boycott of British goods spread quite far across the country. So in 1896, there were Swadeshi associations that were being set up in Bombay. We know that there was, quote unquote, a monster meeting in Berar of 5,000 people, where people had pledged to wear only Indian cloth and boycott Manchester goods. And again, why are these activities taking place in 1895 in places like Lahore or Bombay or Berar? Well, it's around the same time that tariff policies and cotton duty goods are being debated in London. And the outrage that it created in India, that once more here are British people trying to stymie our industrial output and give an extra set of incentives to Manchester industrials to dump imported goods, that led to the Swadeshi activity. So again, very globally connected to a lot of policies that were taking place, at the center of empire. So again, the type of Swadeshi activity you see in the 1890s again represents how multifarious, Swadeshi could be. So some of you may recognize this particular structure. This is today called the Mahatma Phule Mandai in Pune. It originally was called the Ray Market, and it started out as being a market, but also more than just a market. It was also a museum. It started out as being the Ray Industrial Museum as well. I assume the Industrial Museum probably took place in the tower, and the market was where, and where the wings were located. Now, that Industrial Museum was named after a British governor, Lord Ray. We have landmarks here in Bombay associated with Ray, like Ray Road, for example. But the museum was again a product of that impetus for Indian exhibitions that was started by people like Ranade. One of the people who was involved in starting this Ray Industrial Museum was N.B. Namjoshi. who was an affiliate of Tilak. Tilak was, of course, involved in a lot of Swadeshi activism at this time, and his associates were, in turn, involved with people like Ranade, who are still holding these exhibitions. And this museum was designed to show not just indigenous Indian goods, but also imported goods from Europe that were imported into India in order to encourage Indians to kind of copy them and learn from them and produce their own copies as well. So this museum was set up specifically with something called an export wing and an information center, which was designed to encourage Indians to export their goods and learn where they could export their goods across not just the British Empire, but as well as to other places like China, Japan, and such as well. So again, a very export orientation given to Swadeshi activity. And again, kind of summing things up, people like Tilak, who were involved in Swadeshi activity, were also involved in kind of a capitalist-oriented, export-oriented type of Swadeshi enterprise, the types of which were attempted to be established in Poona in the 1880s and 1890s. And Tilak, again, later in his life, becomes the advocate of a type of Swadeshi which is much more in tune with what we would think of Swadeshi in Bengal or Gandhi. But in the 1870s and 1880s, through publications like the Maratha and the Kesari, after both are established in 1880, he starts to think of Swadeshi again in very global terms. So, for those of you who've read Ross Bassett's really interesting book called The Technological Indian, he looks at models like MIT in the United States. And says, we could benefit from an MIT in India, because then we could produce engineers who could be used to set up, cotton mills or textile mills or jute mills in India, and set up an industrial economy that would help make Pune and Bombay and other centers in India into important manufacturing hubs and centers. And we do know that the type of activity that Tilak was engaged with in the 1890s and 1880s stimulated some indigenous capitalist enterprise. So people like the Kirloskars might have been influenced by this stimulus in Pune. And the Kirloskars were involved in pretty basic manufacturing stuff. I mean, like agricultural implements or bicycles. But this was something. I mean, this was something that provided jobs to a lot of people and provided, an impetus for manufacturing technology. There were other people like, those who set up something called the Pesafan Glass Works, which was started by an Indian graduate of MIT. And the capital was raised by ordinary Indians. This MIT graduate actually went around to villages in Maharashtra and raised funds from ordinary villagers to provide capital for these glassworks. So, in conclusion, what I'm trying to show over here is that, Swadeshi in this very early era was multiple things. It was not the type of Gandhian Swadeshi. It was not the type of Bengali Swadeshi. It was not the type of kind of self-reliance or Atmanirbhar, whatever you want to call it, that you see is still being bandied about today. It oftentimes was fully complementary in a capitalist, globalist-oriented economy that was geared toward exports. And people from Ranade to Tilak thought of India in terms of being, a large industrial manufacturing economy, and saw Swadeshi as a method for India's economic growth. So with that, I'll end my talk, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dinyar. It's such a fascinating backstory, and especially that angle which you gave, that Swadeshi was not really just boycotting. It was also about being self-reliant and Atmanirbhar that people are talking about these days. Could you tell us a little bit about the Bombay Swadeshi store? Because I'm sure that would be a question in many people's minds, considering they're from Bombay.
Yeah. So, I mean, those of you, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Bombay store, right? The store that's located on Firoz Shah Mehta Road and has outlets in various places. That's the Bombay Swadeshi store. It was established in 1906 in order to promote Swadeshi goods. Now, this, the fact that it takes place in 1906 is, of course, because the largest Swadeshi movement across India had been set up, and Bombay was a forum for Swadeshi activities as well. And the person who sets up who inaugurates that Swadeshi store, I believe it was first set up in the offices of the Times of India in Boribandar, was Dadabhai Naoroji. And so when Naoroji came to Bombay in 1906, on the way to the Calcutta Congress, one of the first things he did was he inaugurated the store. And the interesting thing about the store is that, when he inaugurates the store, he says specifically, this store needs to be run on economic lines. Swadeshi needs to be economically a viable proposition. Now, when Gandhi opens a Swadeshi store in Bombay in, I think, 1920 or 1919, he says something very different. He says, Swadeshi is not about making profits. It's about, giving the poorest of the poor an opportunity to, buy goods. So again, here are very different meanings of Swadeshi taking place in the same city by two people who knew one another.
Question really about the backstory and the drain theory. The question from Ashish is that what role did the spread of the railway network play in the draining of India's resources?
It's a contested topic. I mean, for those of you who know, the scholarship, some of the modern scholarship that's been done on economic history, there are people who argue that the railways were a method for the drain of wealth of India, and certainly people like Dadabhai Naoroji and I.C. Dutt and Ranade thought this was the case. But contemporary economic scholars like Tirthankar Roy disagree and say that actually the drain of wealth was quite exaggerated, and things like the railway actually you can't really blame the railways for doing damage. I tend to lean more on the side of, and again, I'm not specifically an economic historian. Someone like Tirthankar Roy knows much more about what he's talking about than I do. But certainly there are enough examples where railways did do real damage, right? I mean, the railways essentially integrated elements of Indian society and areas of India into the global economy. And those areas of India were not prepared for what came, right? I mean, trade was still being carried out in a rather pre-capitalist manner. And when you have the railways, now, British imported goods can flood into the territory and completely undercut, any sort of, indigenous goods. So, Berar, for example, if you read Sven Beckert's book on cotton, he cites Berar as an example of a place where the railways did a lot of bad. Because Berar, once it was connected with railways, became the place where, cotton was grown in mass. And what that meant was that, indigenous farmers in Berar had very little incentive to produce crops for food. And, when the price for cotton cratered, you just had a lot of cotton on your hand and not much food, and not surprisingly, a famine ensued. So there were examples of where railways, by integrating the global economy in large parts of India, did a lot of damage.
There's a question about progressive Scotsmen. You mentioned Buist. Are there any others we should know about as Taranjot Singh? And did their Scottishness help their pro-India stance, is what his question is?
It's a good question. Yeah, I mean, the Scots have always had a bit of an independent streak about them, and a bit of, they've all, for a long time grumbled about integration into the Union in 1707 with England and Wales. And I think a lot of Scotsmen who came to Bombay, and, again, aside from Boyce, there were others like, there was a man called George Patton. Not George Patton, sorry, I'm not talking about the general, but there was a man called Professor Patton. I'm forgetting what his first name was, but he was a professor in Elphinstone College. He supported a lot of the social reform activities of young Bombay. These Scotsmen, for some reason or the other, were much more willing to kind of, mix with Indians and, mix with ordinary, Indians, whether they were elites or, people living in, next to them who were working as servants or whatever. And they didn't have that kind of haughty sense of superiority, which you saw amongst Britons in places like, say, Calcutta. And so, perhaps due to the Scottish Enlightenment, perhaps due to the chip on the shoulders that many Scotsmen had about, kind of English imperialism, they could oftentimes be quite sympathetic towards Indians. Not always, definitely not always. I mean, there are a dime a dozen examples of both Irishmen and Scotsmen who are not, very sympathetic. I mean, a man like Dufferin, who was the Viceroy of India in the 1880s, Dufferin could be quite critical of Indians. And the fact that he was an Irishman didn't seem to really sway much of his opinions about Indian society.
So the question from Madhuvanti is, on balance, do you think the Swadeshi cloth manufacturing helped in some way to get the nation independent and strong?
Well, that's a very large question.
Yes.
And I can't do justice to it. I mean, certainly Swadeshi, the later incarnation of Swadeshi under Gandhi, it was a very powerful symbol. It was, Swadeshi cloth and Khadi cloth had value as a symbol in terms of its, ability to kind of unite the poor with the rich and kind of show solidarity across class and caste and whatever. So in that role, it definitely did play an important role. I am nevertheless critical of, what Swadeshi has done in terms of, the reason why still to this day we have people talking about self-reliance and self-sufficiency and Atmanirbhar, which I think personally is not the smartest of things to talk about, tends to come from this emphasis on economic self-reliance, which really came about in the 1920s and 1930s, which I think did a lot of damage, quite frankly. Because it prevented India from becoming taking advantage of being a part of a globally oriented export economy, industrial economy after Indian independence. You don't have to read many economic textbooks to show the difference in the economic trajectories between a place like Korea or Japan and India and, say, Nigeria, both of which followed kind of import substitution models. One group of countries became rich and prosperous, and the other group of countries are still kind of wrestling with the misgivings about global capitalism. So, the Swadeshi legacy is complex and it's not always good. It's done a lot of damage, I think, also in terms of India's ability to be globally competitive. And this is not just my idea. I mean, someone like Ashok Desai, who was a civil servant and also someone who's written quite a bit on Indian economic history, has talked about how these ideas contributed to a certain sense of xenophobia, economic xenophobia, kind of a paranoia about foreign goods and foreign trade after independence, and we still see that today, right? Atmanirbhar, for example. Swadeshi is a mixed blessing.
Question from Bharat. Before the word Swadeshi became common, what was the concept of local manufacturing called?
It was all over the place, quite frankly. Indigenous manufacturers, native goods, native industry, pledging to support the goods produced by your own countrymen. I mean, that's at least what you see in English. I haven't had a chance really to kind of delve into, it's easy to look through English stuff because that's searchable. If you want to search in Gujarati or Marathi or whatever, I know Gujarati, but not Marathi, it's much more complex because it's not like you can do a search term for Swadeshi and get, hits. You have to go through everything. And consequently, it gets quite difficult to do that. You certainly do see the term Swadeshi Vastu come up in Hindi by the 1890s.
Question from Kalyani Pandit. You mentioned the Kirloskar. Were there any other industrialists who came from humble backgrounds? Unlike the Tatas, for example.
Yeah, there were a lot. And there probably are a lot who we don't really know about or who haven't really been documented as yet. So I'll give you one example. There was a man called either NB or SB Wagle. Now, that could be an N or an S because his handwriting was quite terrible and I couldn't understand whether that was an N or an S. But, this was a man, a Maharashtrian, I can't remember if he came from Poona or Bombay, but he went to London in the 1890s in order to learn glassmaking. Now, India historically had been very good at producing glass, right? I mean, we've had Sheesh Mahals and stuff like that. But by the 1870s, apparently, Indian abilities to produce glass was so bad that even when glass was exhibited at those exhibitions that Ranade was organizing, in the 1870s, people commented, "My God, this stuff is really bad." It was not good. So a lot of Indians went to Great Britain in order to learn, glass making technology in places like Britain or Japan or America. And Wagle was one of these people. So he went to London, studied glass making. He apparently took out a number of loans from Dadabhai Naoroji, which he never paid back. So, we have a lot of angry letters from Dadabhai Naoroji later on saying, you still owe me X amount of pounds. What's going on? But nevertheless, he came back to India. He set up a glass manufactory, but apparently it didn't work. It failed. A lot of these indigenous industrialists, a lot of the industry fails. And that's especially the case by the 1910s. there is a wave of Swadeshi failure that takes place around 1913. Swadeshi banks go under, Swadeshi firms go under in Bengal and Bombay. And, you know, the reasons for why this happened, I mean, some of it was just because of, you know, bad management or corruption. I mean, you know, bank scams are not new in India, right? We've done a very good job of pioneering that from a very early era. So there were lots of bank scams in Bombay in this point in time also. But a lot of it was just because, you know, the odds were stacked against Indians, right? I mean, British industry had the British government on the side. And so if you wanted to set up a steamship company in Bombay or Chittagong or you know, Tuticorin in the Madras presidency, the British government will oftentimes work very overtly to undercut you. And so, you know, a lot of that idea that, you know, Swadeshi capitalism would not work by itself and that capitalism itself was kind of inherently stacked against Indians starts to take root around this time, or that the government really needs to come in and kind of protect infant industry and you know, kind of, sorry about that, that's probably IKEA, you know, kind of step in and you know, play a role in protecting Indian industry. That starts to take place around the time of World War I. There are others who do succeed. I mean, the Kirloskar's are a good example. This Pesa glass fund that I talked about did work for some time. I'm not sure what happens eventually, but there are examples. You know, Bengal Chemicals is a good example, which was founded by P.C. Ray. And P.C. Ray is a fascinating guy in the sense that, you know, he goes from being someone in the 1890s and 1900s who was really talking about the need for Indians to be entrepreneurial and capitalist, and the need to set up industry. And by the 1920s, he's completely deflated and a different man. You know, he says India should not be an industrial country. It should be agricultural, because industry is not going to be the cure-all for. There are just too many people in India, and you know, industry will not solve their woes. And he becomes a rather staunch Gandhian. So it kind of shows kind of this crisis of confidence that people have in capitalism around the time of World War I in India.
Ashish mentions that Wagle could be Ogale, who started a glass factory in Talegaon.
It could be. I think Ogale was earlier. I'm not sure what Ogale's dates were.
Okay.
But I'd be, you know, I mean, please email me if you know you know any information about that. You know, that could be something good to investigate.
We have an architect in our midst, Isa Sheikh, who says he's making a connection between Swadeshi and the Indo-Saracenic movement in architecture. Do you buy into that thought?
So this is something I've not investigated as yet. I mean, there certainly is, maybe not Indo-Saracenic, but an arts and crafts link with Swadeshi. I mean, you are probably familiar with E.B. Havel, the British you know, artist. I think he was affiliated with the J.J. School, and others like Swinton Jacob were, of course, influential in kind of pioneering the Indo-Saracenic style of architecture. Their interest, again, was also reviving Indian traditions of design and manufacture. It's something I sympathize with. I mean, every time I see one of these new ugly towers pop up in Matunga or Dadar, I think, my God, you know, India once having this great architectural tradition, look what we've been reduced to. But, you know, those people were interested in kind of reviving the Indian artisan or the Indian mason or, you know, the Indian architect. And so they played a role, you know, in some forms in stimulating Swadeshi activity, even though later on people like E.B. Havel would condemn and dismiss the actual Swadeshi movement. So they kind of lit the fire in certain regards, even though they themselves were not necessarily supportive. Indo-Saracenic, its roots go back much earlier, sorry. I mean, the roots, of course, go back to kind of the 1860s and 1870s after the mutiny. And oftentimes it's meant to kind of signify power dynamics, right? And at least if you buy the argument of, you know, certain people who've written on the topic, in the sense that, you know, you could have a European style building, which is European in form, like VT, but you have Indian styles grafted onto it. So kind of showing you that, you know, this building is European in form, but it can wear an Indian dress. So it's a bit more complex than that.
Okay, last question from Rajendra. Rajendra, you've raised your hand. Please unmute yourself and ask your question, if that was your intent. Okay, Rajendra is not responding, but we'll take one more question from Adil Desai. Which building of the Times of India had the Swadeshi goods shop, the present one or the one near the erstwhile Elphinstone Circle?
I think it is the present one. I think so. I mean, don't take my word 100% for that. I believe I've seen references to the store being in Boribandar, and another mention of that store being in the Times of India building. So putting two and two together, that leads us to believe that it's that building.
So you said this is a topic under research, Dinyar. When does your book or paper or monograph come out?
That's a good question. I mean, as any professor, you kind of have so many pots on the stove and you don't know when anything is going to finish. I mean, again, this began out of discussion with a few other academics some years ago when Atmanirbhar was bandied about by the government to as a broader discussion of what is going on with India's economic policy and what's gone wrong with it. And from that, it's kind of matured into a paper which me and another scholar, as I mentioned, in Singapore, were talking about, kind of talking about the history of the idea of self-reliance in Swadeshi. That particular paper, I just think is just too big to write because, I mean, you could write books on Swadeshi, and people have written books on Swadeshi. So, I mean, a group of scholars hopefully will be myself included, hopefully will be presenting in Boston in early 2023 on some ideas related to Swadeshi, and maybe a paper will come out of it. And whenever I get around to my second book, which again is kind of gathering dust, this will be part of it, kind of looking at ideas that Indians had for industry and commerce in this era.
Great. All the very best in your research.
Thank you.
Thank you for accepting our invitation, Dinyar, and thank you for illuminating us with the backstory, really, of Swadeshi. Thank you, audience, for attending. Thanks, Dinyar.
And thanks to you and to everyone at Khaki as well.